I think I would start by just saying gods don't write texts. Humans write texts, and that's a great starting point. And if that's the case, then it benefits us to study how humans make texts and why we make texts. What is the human impulse to write narratives like this? Why is that meaningful to us? I think if I could have it my own way in history, it would be nice if God just parachuted out of the sky a list of like 10 things for us to believe and hang on to. But that wouldn't be very meaningful and it wouldn't last. I think narratives and stories are the things that really impact people and can be recycled from generation to generation.
Welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Evan Vossman. I think this is the second time that somebody produced something on the internet that I reached out to them to have them on. The first one was a tweet thread, and this one is a zine that was made for like a Christian formation program at a local church. So yeah, that was it's fun. I enjoy talking about articles and books and things like that, but this is a little bit off the beaten path, even for me, which I'm already kind of off the beaten path. So that said, if you're listening for free, please follow, subscribe, whatever term they use on your preferred podcast platform. I appreciate the support in advance. If you want to go one step further, please write a review or give a rating wherever it is that you're listening. One further step would be follow on social media. You will find out the day that within a day of my recording a new interview, who they are, when it's coming out. But the ultimate support would be become a $5 supporter at patreon.com/itmeanswhatitmeans podcast. And that's all one word. Yeah, so I will not delay any further. I don't have any news to talk about up here on the front end of the podcast. I will be back at the end to set up next week's episode. Okay, enjoy my conversation with Evan Vossman. Evan Vossman, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jared. Thanks for having me.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Evan Vossman. I'm a scholar of ancient Jewish texts. So I primarily study the Hebrew Bible, Dead Sea Scrolls, and the earliest rabbinic writings, which are often known as the Tannaitic literature, is the title. The subjects there captured my attention probably like halfway through undergrad. So I would say around that time, I discovered the Cincinnati campus of Hebrew Union College. And I discovered that this school was basically in my backyard. So I grew up in Cincinnati and I've never left, but I had never heard of it until that point. So a mutual friend introduced me to a HUC doctoral student. We talked about the program that day, and then I just felt like enamored. One of the best things about the Cincinnati campus is that students from the rabbinic and the graduate programs take most of their classes together. So it's a great opportunity to read sacred texts with people from different backgrounds. You can also develop really meaningful interfaith dialogue. So it's just a cool environment. So I applied to the Master's in Jewish Studies program there, and then I started my PhD there after I graduated. Currently, I am ABD, or all but dissertation. So that means I've finished every part of my doctoral program except for dissertation. So right now, I teach undergrad Pentateuch course at University of Dayton 2 days a week, and then I work on my dissertation. But outside of that, this will be relevant for the podcast today. Outside of that, I'm also a member and licensed preacher at Church of the Advent in Cincinnati. So Advent is an Episcopal church that focuses heavily on arts, biblical, theological education, and creation care. So I've had the opportunity to witness a pretty cool story up close. Advent, the building and the congregation has been there since, I think, 1855. But the church came close to shutting down during the last 10 years. But the priest now, Dan Carlson, started in 2023, and the church has rapidly grown ever since. So many things and people have contributed to this, but one element has been regular, what are called formation events. which Advent hosts. So Advent is really fortunate to have multiple staff members and congregants with graduate level education in either biblical studies or theological studies. So these people lead events on a variety of topics to congregants, just trying to share education and things that we've learned. And Advent always produces an accompanying what's called a zine. And these zines help congregants process the material with art, essentially. So Advent has found there's something really powerful about combining education with the arts. And so the one that I led this summer was called Tour of the Torah, which was pretty fun.
And that, wow, man, I feel like I think I should just like mute my mic and just let you keep talking because you answered you answered the question I asked, or like tell us a little bit about yourself, but you also answered my first question. So that is interesting because, and I'm not saying this to throw shade. I know, my whole life growing up in churches, when I thought of church growth, I did not think of Episcopal churches.
Yeah.
And that's not to say they don't have it, but it really is just, mega churches out there don't tend to have that liturgical bent, maybe. So is it more of a high church environment, or where do you guys situate yourselves there?
Yeah, it's so we have two services. So the 10 a.m. is going to be more high church and liturgical. Then we have a noon service that's more conversational style. So the noon service will be in the back of the church, and it's basically people are seated in a semicircle. There's still liturgy used, but then when it comes down to the lectionary texts, it's going to be more conversation.
That was actually, I was going to have a follow up on that. Are you still using the lectionary for that? Okay, so one has a structured homily, and the other using the same biblical texts, but in a conversational way with the room. Okay, that's
Right.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I probably won't keep it open just because most of my backgrounds are bright or are dark, and this one's really bright. But I have the t- tour of the Torah open here, and I'll say, just like aesthetically, I think you did a good job. So I'm not sure. Did you work on that alone? That part?
Oh, I should be more explicit about this. So I'm responsible for the text in that, and
Okay.
I'm responsible for the general theme and direction of like the tour and the travel themes. But my friend Jacob Taylor actually was the one that produces the art for the zine. So Jacob is the minister for arts, media, and community at Advent. He has theological training, is a really talented artist. So he's the one that crafts the zines for every formation event in collaboration with the presenters. And typically, he will collaborate with local artists to produce something that's really engaging and interesting. But they do all of that at the, it's called the Advent Workshop. So they do that at the church.
Well done, Jacob.
Yeah.
So what was, I guess, the conceit of it being a tour, and you talk about baggage and things like that, checking our baggage. How did you decide on that as an angle of entry into walking people through the development of Torah?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the text and the Torah are often, I think people feel intimidated by them, at least in Christian contexts. Um, so yeah, I would say that I feel really motivated to help people grow in their knowledge of ancient Judaism. So I think that ancient Judaism is fascinating enough in its own right to study without any overarching religious goal. But since Christians read the Old and New Testaments as scripture, it's super beneficial to study the world that produced those texts. So I think knowledge of both Israelite religion and ancient Judaism make these texts, I would say they come alive when you know some things about that. So in my experience, the texts become more interesting. They're more thrilling, even they're more meaningful when you start to understand how they were formed and what were the original needs that they might have addressed. So I really just wanted to impart some of these ideas to congregants at Advent. I thought the tour and travel themes might be like a fun way to get into that.
So you mentioned two categories in there: Judaism and ancient and Israelite religion. Can you
Mhm.
break down? Is that a meaningful distinction, or are those just two categories that can be used interchangeably?
I think they're meaningful distinctions. I think Judaism is a product of the Babylonian exile. Um, I think that what was happening pre-exile might be better described as Israelite religion. I don't know if either term is exactly perfect, but I think it's a useful distinction.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, terms are they do the work we ask them to do, and maybe we hope for a little bit more.
Right.
Uh, how have people accepted this? Have you, because you've started, you used it, I think you said over, during August, right? Is that when it?
I think we did that in the summer.
Okay,
Yes, that would
that's
have
what it
been. I
was.
think it was August. Uh-huh.
Okay, yeah, we were when we were in when you and I were in dialogue about how we should schedule things. I think we were just like, let's wait till August because that worked for both of us. That's why I'm thinking August. But how was it received?
Yeah. So as we were talking about, my initial target audience were congregants at my church. I've watched this circle slowly expand, though. To start, I feel that the congregants at Advent really clicked with the ideas. They were thinking really deeply about how to integrate them with their faith. My zine and the other ones that the church has produced are usually out on a table every Sunday morning. Whenever I see someone stop by it, I usually see one person grab mine, which is fun. So I think this is a sign that people are interested in this literature and they want a thoughtful, interactive way to get started with it. But outside of that, there's also been interest from the Episcopal Diocese of Southern Ohio, and they are talking about expanding the zine and maybe publishing it on a wider scale. I've seen friends and fellow scholars take copies and find it useful. I gave a stack of them to students at University of Dayton. I've received some positive feedback from them as they prepare for their lectures and quizzes. So, yeah, I would say the response overall has been really positive.
So, so the main audience is a Christian audience, and
Mm-hmm.
okay, so a while back, and I won't ask you to answer for another scholar's work, but this is just for context, because it seems like two, I guess, different, maybe overlapping approaches. But I had a conversation with Kyle Hughes about his book Scripting the Sun, and he's dealing with like prosopological exegesis of texts of the Hebrew Bible. And in my mind, while I'm reading that book, it was really tough because the more historical, cultural, text critical kind of approach to biblical text makes more sense to me and seems a little bit more reliable. Do you find, because I think both are represented not necessarily equally throughout like Christian biblical interpretation history, are you doing something distinct from a lot of the like Christian theological approaches to Hebrew Bible or Old Testament in this enterprise?
I would say in this scene, what I'm trying to do, the way that I am trained is as a biblical scholar. So I have not been trained to think theologically in my academic context. So any theological work that I wanted to do during coursework and beyond has been my own stuff to do on my own. So I think what I'm trying to do with the zine is do my best at doing a theological integration of academic material and presenting that to an audience so that when they encounter a scholarly perspective on how these texts were formed, it's not something that is totally jarring and there's no option theologically for what to do with it. So that was my one of my overarching goals.
And that kind of fits within let's check our baggage. So
Mm.
can we do that real quick? What baggage do you think, assuming that insofar as there is an audience for this podcast, most of them are American Christians, what baggage do you think they're probably bringing to their reading of Torah?
Yeah, I listed a few examples. Let's see. One I put was that people tend to read the Torah as if it's all about Jesus. I said I recognize that the Christian impulse to search for hints of Jesus in these texts. I don't necessarily reject that reading strategy altogether, but I think it can be helpful to expand horizons. So in the zine I wrote, and I'll just go ahead and read this, but in the zine I wrote, Jews and Christians read the Torah as a prelude to something else. For Jews, it leads to rabbinic literature, whereas for Christians, it leads to the New Testament. One Christian reading strategy is to search Torah for hints of Jesus, but this is only one method. These texts existed for centuries before Jesus, and Jews have comfortably read them without Christ for over 2,000 years. So, what other meanings might they contain? So, yeah, I think Christians should start asking questions like, how did ancient Jews read this text in the centuries before Jesus? Or how have Jews read this for the last 2,000 years without Jesus? These questions also are imperfect. They kind of presuppose that Judaism is somehow oriented around Jesus, but it absolutely isn't. But I think for Christians, though, those questions can help to open up some new insights. Another example of baggage that I put in the zine, I said the Torah is often used as an authoritative source to support modern causes. So specifically what I wrote, I put, Christians rightfully expect Scripture to shape our life in theology, but interpretation requires patience and nuance. Diverse biblical scholars and theologians can help us in this process. For now, let's start by considering the gap between our world and the ancient one that produced these texts. The scribes who composed Torah knew nothing about our worldview. So I'm obviously sympathetic to the desire to make these ancient texts relevant to modern life. I do that myself, but I think that this needs to be done carefully. So the common method of proof texting, for example, or taking random isolated Bible verses out of context to argue a political or ideological point in the modern world, I think that's usually going to be unhelpful. I think theological questions are better served by, and this is a chapter in the ancient slavery and its New Testament context, the authors that you've been interviewing lately. But Yvonne Zimmerman does a chapter on slow down ethics. I think that slow down ethics approach is more helpful. Uh, People can sit on things with some patience. They can read carefully, have some nuance and some humility. Study the ancient context first, and then I think the theological task is how do we bridge the gap between the ancient world and our modern context?
It's so it's so tough though, because theology is really the reason that a lot of people are, I think, even motivated to read, particularly Christians are even motivated to read biblical texts. And I remember being a teenager and like starting in Genesis and starting to read. And I think by the time I got to like Numbers or something, someone said, no, you should start with the book of John. And one, I think that's not a helpful reading strategy. But two, and probably more importantly, it, it like, it just draws out it removes the story aspect from everything. That it's okay to pick up at this point, because now you're learning everything you need to know, and then you'll go backward and you'll just see how all of that, Memento or Tarantino your way through reading of biblical texts. And so, okay, when you say research or learn about the ancient context, what's a good place to start? And I know I'm kind of jumping the gun because I'll be asking for recommendations, but like, if you're just at home with your NRSV or whatever, where do you go?
Yeah, I think that kind of depends on the perspective that you want. So for like scholarly treatments, I have some recommendations. I mean, I think one scholar's E. Theodore Mullen. He wrote a book called Ethnic Myths and Pentateuchal Foundations. So he's trying to ask, how are these texts trying to create a Jewish ethnic identity after the exile? So obviously it's going to be a more scholarly approach, but I think it's really helpful. Another one in that camp might be Norman Wybray. He wrote a book called The Making of the Pentateuch. If you want something more approachable, I think if you're thinking of the person just at home with their NRSV, I think the SBL Study Bible or the Jewish Study Bible are really great. So they've got introductory articles, they've got commentary verse by verse for all these. I think it's super great resources. There's all kinds of like introduction to Old Testament books. I think David Carr has a really good one. I think Pete Enns and Jared Bias, the stuff they're doing with Genesis and Exodus for normal people, those books are really helpful too. Yeah.
Okay. No, that's, and like I said, I know, and I'll probably be asking again, so you'll get another chance to, if there's anybody you left off the list. Let's talk documentary hypothesis. It's come up on the podcast a little bit, but you bring this up. So 18th century, right? Wellhausen, he makes this proposal that was pretty groundbreaking at the time, right?
Mhm.
What was that?
Yeah, it's actually 19th century, so it's gonna be late 1800s.
Okay, I thought
Um,
it was late 1700s. Sorry.
yeah, well, so um, sometime within the this may not be exactly perfect, but I would say sometime probably in the third century BCE, we start to get texts that refer to these collection of texts as the Law of Moses. That view becomes dominant, and I think a lot of that is in the ancient world. They don't have notions of copywriting. They don't have notions of they're not celebrating individual creativity necessarily. I think in the ancient mindset, what's older is better. So a text becomes authoritative by linking it to an authoritative figure from the past. I think since Moses is one of the main characters of the Torah or the Pentateuch, it gradually became associated with him and became the law of Moses. Fast forward a few centuries, I think this is the world that Jesus grows up into. And so when we see reference to these texts in the Gospels, at times Jesus will say, Moses said X, Y, and Z. Or haven't you read in the law of Moses that it says X, Y, and Z? So that view becomes the dominant perspective up until even the Middle Ages, where I don't think most people had the education, um, desire, access to text, or even really the audacity to question that dominant perspective. After the Enlightenment, you very, very slowly get the decoupling of church and state. You have more opportunities to ask critical questions about these authoritative religious texts. And then we can fast forward a little bit to, like we were saying, 19th century with Wellhausen. There had been other people before Wellhausen that were starting to develop what we now know as the documentary hypothesis. But I think we can say that Wellhausen was the one to popularize it and present it in a really clear and masterful form. Um, but the main thrust of Wellhausen's argument is that the Pentateuch or the Torah is not created by Moses at all. Instead, it's created by a number of scribes writing from a large span of time. So for him, this starts in the 10th century BCE, probably under the reign of David and Solomon. And that's when we get what's called the J source. So it's called the J source because in those texts, God is referred to by the divine name, Yahweh or Adonai. In German, there's no Y like we have in English, but the letter J makes the Y sound. So it's the Yahwist or the J source. After that, the J source is said to be created in the southern kingdom of Judah. After that, we have the E source or the Elohist, because in those texts, God's name is usually Elohim. The Elohist is created in the 9th century in the northern kingdom of Israel. After the Assyrian exile of the northern kingdom eliminates Israel, then the scribes in the southern kingdom are said to inherit those E texts, and they combine J and E to create JE. Then moving forward a little bit more, in the 7th century BCE, we have the production of D texts, or what's mostly in Deuteronomy. Then fast forward past the Babylonian exile, we have what's called the P texts, or the priestly source. So the priestly texts are concerned with priestly matters. There might be narratives and laws that are strewn about. Much of what we see in Leviticus would be considered priestly texts. And then sometime around then, you have scribes that are bringing together JE, D, and P to create what we now know as the Torah or the Pentateuch. That's the general layout of Wellhausen's theory.
So, okay. And there could be a third option I'm not thinking of. Is this he and others are reading the text and they're seeing differences within like a unified text that lead them to infer that this came from multiple places, or are there actual extant documents that reflect the absence of one? Or does that make sense?
Yeah. So part of the reasoning behind this theory is that you see throughout the Pentateuch there are what appear to be doublets So the same story may be told in two different ways, but yet spliced together. An example might be Genesis 1 and 2, or within the flood story. And so scholars at the time were trying to make sense of this, and the thinking was that what we had were two separate documents telling the same story in a different way, and then the scribal editor has felt obliged to keep both. He cannot just scrap one, and so he has done his best to blend them two together and harmonize them.
And is this something that is represented in other texts that make their way down from the ancient world? So, like non-biblical texts, do we see a similar thing happen where various traditions get incorporated in, and then now it's all considered one tradition, or is that not likely?
That's a good question. That's a little bit outside of my research area, so I couldn't speak too much to that. But I think we do see some evidence of that with even cuneiform tablets of these ancient stories. Um, but if you think about it, this is something I emphasize to my students. If the technology that they have at the time is scrolls primarily, um, scrolls are expensive and they're hard to make. So when you make one, you use as much room as possible. So I think often scrolls also have to be categorized and put into places, like cataloged, for example, like for a library. Um, so obviously we can't prove this, but we might imagine that one scroll had, maybe it was like themed. This is the creation scroll. This scroll has lots of different examples of creation type themes or creation type stories. And then it's possible that maybe at some point a scribe wants to retain some of these stories, and so they get blended together. So I think that is one option for how that could have worked with these texts that we have now in the Pentateuch. But outside of that, I can't say too much just because I haven't read that far in the topic. So
That's fair. I remember being in an art history class, and we might have been talking about cave paintings, but it was something very old. And someone in the class said, "How do we know they weren't just doodling? Like, how do we know that what they were doing was significant?" And it's obviously, if you're talking about vellum or any of the other kinds of things that they used in the ancient world, yeah, like it takes work and resources to get those things. But even the ink, or I guess the paints or whatever pigments they were using for the cave paintings, like it took effort. So it was not just as simple as I could reach over here to my right and I've got several pens, and then I've got paper right here and I could just start to scribble. And that probably wasn't carelessly done, right?
mhm.
As a scribe, if you're, and that's, sorry, I probably need to do a better job of hunting down people who focus specifically on scribal transmission, but like, um, it's a very, like, it's a skill heavy profession, I guess, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you do well to mention scribes. I don't think any regular person has any capacity to write text like this. At the very most, the average person might be able to spell their name. They might know enough to read like a business receipt for a transaction of some kind, but even that is not super common, I don't think, in the ancient world. So when we get to the really complex narratives and poetry and legal texts that we see in the Pentateuch, this is the work of scribes. Like, this is the work of a very small elite group of people.
And so, and it's fair, if you don't know, this isn't school, you're not being tested. I know you've spent a long time in school, but you're finally not being tested. So just an average, you know, a person who gets up and they, a subsistence farmer, say, they wouldn't have much engagement with these texts at all in their developmental phase, would they?
No, I don't think so. And in fact, Yonasan Adler argues in his recent book, The Origins of Judaism, that the laws and traditions that we see within the Torah or the Pentateuch don't become widespread until the Hasmonean period. I think his argument is pretty compelling in the book.
And are scholars able to, I guess, draw specific inferences of what their day-to-day engagement would have been at any point, or like what, or actually, a better question here, I'm going to interrupt myself. Do we know much about like any kind of social upheaval as some of these new things start to congeal, some of these new ideas start to present themselves, whether it's through text or in daily life?
Like as the texts become more widely known.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you see groups being defined by how they relate to the ideas of purity. So that would be one example. As notions of ritual purity become more widely known, you see different groups emerge that have a distinct stance on purity. Um, so Yair Furstenberg does great work on this. Yeah, how can groups define themselves by how they conceptualize this? Um, yeah, I would say that's a good place to start.
I think kind of going back to the idea, and I know you were talking about applying biblical text to our life, but I think applying the lack of biblical text to our life, because we're in a phase right now, like societally, where it seems like people feel like there's not a lot of connection. People are losing their moorings. Um, but that kind of seems like the norm, right? Like for ancient people, they were probably connected very immediately to the people around them, but there may not have been a larger understanding of who they were in the world.
Hmm.
So just I don't know. Am I off base there?
No, I think that that's right. I think that I don't think that the stories in the Pentateuch, it took some time for those to feel binding to a community. Um, I think that's why archaeologically we have all kinds of evidence of worship of many, many gods throughout ancient kingdoms of Judah and Israel, because that's reflecting life on the ground. I don't think the singular worship of Yahweh or Adonai was the norm for quite some time. And then we see that reflected in prophetic texts where Jeremiah laments over this. So it's not necessarily like a surprising new discovery, but yeah, I think it took some time for these stories to feel like that was the national story of a larger group of people.
So does it, for you as a biblical scholar, is it a process of, you learn things like that it really wasn't that weird for there to be other gods being worshipped, and then you get to the prophetic text, and you kind of like, how is this situated in the world with where these texts were created? Like, do you have to go back and keep adjusting the puzzle? How does that work for you?
Yeah, I think there's a good analogy, I think, with our modern context in a way. I think there, at any given moment, is always ideological diversity. And even within a group of people who would say that they're sharing the same ideology, there's always diversity. Um, so I think that applies here too, where you've got different biblical texts in production at similar times, and they have different perspectives depending on the writer and what the writer wants to do. And then I think at a later time, these texts are collected into one canon and scripturalized and called the Bible. And now we are left to try to make sense of why is there conflicting pictures of these issues. But I think that's just how any society is at any time.
There's a YouTube channel I really enjoy called Some More News, and yesterday I happened to get home early enough. I had an hour to kill. They just released an episode on nostalgia, and I'm not a fan of nostalgia. I'm a very sentimental man, but that's the one sentiment that I don't really care for. But it really did help to put things in context that uh, I think people cast back with what their understanding of the world is now, and they just think it was always thus.
Hmm.
And approaches to biblical texts. Uh, I grew up in an inerrantist community. I don't know about you, but I grew up in an inerrantist community, and I think it was just easy for us to be like, "This is such a simple reading. This must have always been there." And
Hmm.
then I got older, and whether it was Mark Knoll or any of the other, any of the specifically biblical scholars that I started to read, I was like, ugh, even theologically, like some people you think of as like, oh, these are kind of the guarantors of the tradition. They don't really like this. They don't interpret things that way. Maybe I shouldn't either. But then you start to feel shaky. And I totally get how nostalgia feels concrete, but it really does seem to undermine the actual significance or sometimes even sacredness of a text. And I know there's no question in there, but do you have any thoughts on that? Am I
Yeah.
off base with nostalgia, or is that
No,
something you run into as a biblical scholar?
yeah, I definitely run into that. I think I will present this information for me that just feels casual now, but I think if you haven't heard an idea like that before, it can feel really jarring. But I think if you think about it deeply, it's just like that makes sense. Like I think there's never been a pure version of anything. I had some students the other day actually who were they were asking a question and they said, "Well, Judaism thinks X, Y, and Z." And I said, "Thank you for saying that. I'm going to stop for a moment." And I'm borrowing this from other scholars. I didn't come up with this, but I said Judaism doesn't think anything, and Christianity does not think anything. Rather, individual Jews and individual Christians think things. And I think sociologists of religion will describe it this way, where they say Christianity is whatever Christians are doing at any given time, or Christians are believing at any given time. Judaism, I think, can be described the same way. It's a bit unsettling, but I think it's a more historically honest perspective of what we're dealing with here. It's the messiness of humanity.
Yeah, I think even when with baselines, sometime in the last year, I would see on Twitter that Christians were arguing about the Nicene Creed, and that there were some people who were saying that they're Orthodox Christians, but I don't really know if I accept this, and others were like, "Then how can you?" Which here's the thing: you're right. To relate it to politics, I forget where I heard this, but somebody said a Republican is anyone who can win a Republican primary. If you're on the ballot as a Republican, you're a Republican, and that's just not acceptable to a lot of people. And I'm using that as an example because that's what I heard. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
picking that particular party, but the idea that, and this has personally been difficult for me
Mm-hmm.
to think, well, I don't believe all that stuff that I was told I have to believe. So do I have any right to say that I am this thing if I can't bring myself to accept those things, and trying to do the things that a Christian does felt fraudulent to me
Mm-hmm.
because this line had been drawn, and I just respected it when I really didn't have to. And so the last, going on 3 years of this podcast has helped me come to terms with the fact that, like, oh, I get to own this part of my identity, at least because morally and ethically I have all that. Sorry, that's a digression,
Yeah.
but it's also not right, because
Yeah.
now my engagement with biblical text does not have to be one of guilt and shame and fear that, like, this is a waste of my time, I'm a fraud. I
Mm-hmm.
should go call myself something else. and
Yeah.
and I appreciate that you are presenting to people as a scholar, presenting to people in your community that, um, hey, let's try to approach this on its own terms. And
Mm-hmm.
the, so I remember I interviewed Zvi Novik about his book, Judaism, A Guide for Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And I really did not want to ask questions that were like, okay, can you translate Judaism into Christian terms? Right? Like, you guys are just Christianity without Jesus, because that's not, I know Judaism doesn't think anything, but it certainly isn't just Christianity sans Jesus.
Yeah.
So, again, approaching biblical texts on their own. Have you? Okay, so I asked if it had been accepted well. Have you seen in your community maybe people, um, like, how they're approaching Hebrew Bible texts differently now after this?
Yeah, I think that they are now. I think a lot of them had already had some notion of these theories before. They just didn't have a name for it, and I don't know if they'd ever expressed it out loud before. So I peppered in a lot of questions as I was teaching. And a common one I would ask is like, I tend to frame it this way, where I don't say, "Tell me what you all think." I say, "Tell me what you all have heard." Kind of creates some detachment, makes it easier to say ideas. But I would ask them, tell me what you have heard about where these texts came from. Many will obviously say that Moses wrote it, or God inspired Moses to wrote it. It came down from God somehow. But others will talk about, like, they didn't have a name for it yet, but they'll say, like, I've heard that there are these like sources where it's not one complete thing, but you can see traces of different writings in there. And what's nice about that is that I can be like, yes, that is a thing, and it has a name, and this is how it tends to work. in scholarship. So I think that's one of the takeaways is people finally had language for these things.
So I guess with the, it came from God. If that were what someone said, so that's what they've said. What is the, how do you engage with them without necessarily bursting that bubble? Like, can they draw a circle around that, and then here's how you can engage with, oh, it was developed over time in this way, and they still get to hold on to that because that's very important to them.
Yeah, I think so. I think I would start by just saying gods don't write texts. Humans write texts, and that's a great starting point. Um, and if that's the case, then it benefits us to study how humans make texts and why we make texts. What is the human impulse to write narratives like this? Why is that meaningful to us? I think if I could have it my own way in history, it would be nice if God just parachuted out of the sky a list of like 10 things for us to believe and hang on to, but that wouldn't be very meaningful and it wouldn't last. Um, I think narratives and stories are the things that really impact people and can be recycled from generation to generation. So I think I would start with that point. I think I even said that during the formation event at one point where, yeah, humans are the ones who make texts. So,
So there can be a little bit of humanity there. I think maybe also it might make the divine a little bit more approachable.
yeah, I think so. Pete Enns does work on this in his book, Inspiration and Incarnation. He talks about how most Christians are really comfortable with the idea of Jesus being the incarnation of God. They are comfortable with the idea of Jesus being somehow fully God and fully human. And the humanity of Jesus is the thing that brings us great comfort. So if Jesus suffered death and suffered betrayal and this list of things a part of the human condition, then we might feel more comfortable because we think that's God knows what that's like. So that's its own thing. But then when we get to the Bible, we tend to get really uncomfortable when we see humanness and messiness in it. And so Enns makes the argument that like the Bible is also incarnational in a way. It's made by humans, it's shaped by humans over time. And I think, and he thinks too, that the divine can work within that process to get us a story that forms us in a particular way.
There is a reason that Pete Enns is a public facing scholar now, though. Uh, I I think that book came out around like what 2004, 2005,
Mm-hmm.
and he was with Westminster Theological Seminary
Yeah.
until around that time. And he does listen. He does great work. He is, it's him and On Script and Two Cities and um, what's the one with Phil Vischer and Caitlin. I'm sorry, I'm blanking out on that one. Holy Post. Yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
think they do a good job of helping the public engage, and they're out on social media and doing that. But there is a reason that he's out there, and it's because that approach of saying, to get nerdy for a minute, the Council of Chalcedon said that Jesus was fully God and fully man, and so we can accept that Scripture is fully inspired and fully an artifact of human creation, and we need to work that out. That's tough. That raises questions. That's a thing that is controversial when you come from an inerrantist tradition that says the Bible has no flaws and therefore is not produced by people. What I don't want to do, and I don't think you want to do this either. I don't, and I don't think he's doing this. I don't want to treat it like I'll just speak broadly here, a holiday mytho figure that we take away from people by saying this was never real,
Mm-hmm.
because the idea that God is like a mathematically perfect um, cosmic consciousness is too far. It's way too remote. And I don't think that's what's represented in biblical text or in either Jewish or Christian theological traditions. And so, but I really do feel like people are reaching for that mathematically perfect tradition of God, and then that creeps its way into their understanding of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like what you're saying helps combat that. Do you have any thoughts on that? Anything you want to correct in there?
No, yeah, yeah, I hope my work has been helpful to combat that. Um, One of the feedback that I got from someone at the formation event, I'm going to paraphrase him so I won't get it perfectly, but he essentially said, by the end of this, he said, I almost feel more excited for whatever theory is true because whichever one you presented, whatever it is, I feel that God is committed to us. He is committed to our humanity, our human processes, our bickering about ideology and which is the right path forward. God somehow works within that, and still, at the end of the day, we have the text that we have. That was one of the best responses I could have gotten. I think that's what I wanted by the end. Was that no matter what theory ends up being the best one or the true one, none of them necessarily have to be a deal breaker for one's faith.
I think, and I said this, what will be for listeners a couple of weeks ago, talking about Revelation. I feel like the point is someone else's judgment is none of your business. I kind of feel like maybe being theologically or historically or whatever perfect is not as important as being engaged with people.
Yeah,
And if you find yourself describing your love for your community and it's a really like overwrought, complicated Rube Goldberg device that leads to, and that's how love works, you're probably on the wrong track, because love to me is very simple, very material things. And so for someone to be in a discussion with you about, you're helping them prepare to go engage with Torah. They're doing this tour of the Torah with you. And for them to say, "Oh, I really hope this thing I don't know works out." What I also hear is like, now I'm going to go do something that I think is more important than trying to answer a question that I don't have the answer to. And that is love my neighbor, love the people in my community, whether that's, Advent, or just the people who live in the house next to them. So
yeah.
I really appreciate, told you I was very sentimental. I really appreciate that. If that is what even one person got from what you put together here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sorry, this has been really rambly. Even for me, I feel like this has been a really rambly conversation.
That's totally okay.
Was that that's because you only have to talk to me once. I'm sure it gets old. Well, and you're welcome back anytime you want, by the way. Assuming that you still want to. Was there something that you had in mind as we were coming into this conversation? Like, man, I really hope you asked me about this that I didn't ask.
That's a great question. No, not necessarily off the top of my head. Yeah. I know you had some other questions that you had thrown out.
I did, but like I said, I lose track. Once you start talking, I'm afraid because it's up here. I keep them up on the monitor above the main monitor. So I'm going to
Uh-huh.
be looking up, and I'm trying not to be rude. Yeah.
I think you had asked at one point, where are most scholars landing today, and in these perspectives that I presented.
Actually, yeah. Okay. So with regard to, we'll say documentary hypothesis,
Hmm.
but really anything, where is there like consensus in Hebrew Bible studies, in Torah studies about something like the documentary hypothesis?
Yeah, absolutely no consensus, unfortunately, as with most things. But um, yeah, so in the zine, I presented what's called, and I should make this clear, I presented what's called the classical documentary hypothesis, classical in quotation marks. What that means is I presented the version that is primarily associated with the German biblical scholars Karl Heinrich Klaff and Julius Wellhausen. Um, and that's, like we said, anywhere from the late 1900s to early 20th century. But yeah, so since then, scholars have fiercely debated the documentary hypothesis, and many modifications have been made, and the quote unquote classical version no longer dominates. So I would say now Pentateuchal scholarship is vast. The literature can be kind of dizzying. I think it's safe to say, though, that every scholar, no matter what camp they land in, they are responding to, working with, or building upon the documentary hypothesis in some way. So every scholar agrees these texts didn't come out of thin air. Every scholar thinks that they underwent some sort of a redactionary process. but they disagree about how did this process occur and how did it shape the texts that we have now. So some good examples that might make this a little more concrete. Scholars like Robert Alter or Meyer Sternberg or Adele Berlin, they emphasize what's called the synchronic approach. So that means they're concerned with reading these texts as we have them now, rather than breaking them apart, identifying sources, and tracing the history of the sources. So this is, in essence, a response to the documentary hypothesis and source criticism. Whereas scholars like Joel Baden, Jeffrey Stackert, or Richard Elliott Friedman, they have differences in their approaches, but they're all advocates of the documentary hypothesis. So they find the model useful. They'll write books that argue it should endure today. Other scholars, though, they might retain the language from the documentary hypothesis, but they drastically altered the concepts. So one example would be John Van Seters. He uses the language of J, the J source, but he argues that J is actually an exilic document from the 6th century BCE rather than the 10th century BCE. So that's a pretty big gap. And he uses that to argue a totally different picture. And then other scholars, they might retain the language of P, the priestly source, but then they'll refer to the other texts in the Torah as just non-P. So they might find J, E, and D as imprecise or difficult to prove. And then finally, we didn't talk about this view much, but the Persian period, so-called minimalist view, that is also responding to the documentary hypothesis in a way. So there's no singular Persian period view necessarily, and each scholar has their own idiosyncratic perspective, but scholars in this camp are generally going to be agnostic about identifying pre-exilic material in the Pentateuch with any level of certainty. So they tend to focus on social and ideological issues in post-exilic Persian Yehud is the name of the province at the time. They're going to focus on those issues as the context for the production of Pentateuch texts. And then finally, I think I would say that location tends to be part of this. So where scholars are working influences how you think about things. So the Persian period view tends to be more popular in Scandinavia and some parts of Europe. So scholars like Philip Davies or Niels Peer Lemke, they're from the so-called Sheffield or Copenhagen schools, but they're good examples. Diana Edelman was another scholar. She was formerly on faculty at University of Oslo. So they're going to be more Persian period people, where I think depending on where you go, certain views might be more accepted or more popular.
Okay. Yeah. I think on some level I knew that, but is that just that there'll be someone who happens to be like a doctoral advisor who brings in people who want to do work in that area and that just cultivates a faculty within that institution in that way? How does that work? How do they gravitate geographically?
I think that's a big part of it. I think it's socially as well. I think certain parts of Europe are post-Christian in a way. And so it's easier to come at these texts with critical perspectives. Whereas in the US, which tends to be really shaped by Puritanism from our origins, it's harder to do that depending on where you're at. If you're in the American South, it's harder to argue for a perspective like that without getting tons of pushback. So yeah, I think culturally and socially, there's an impact there as well.
Okay, thanks for going down that road. That's why I ask, is there anything that I, not necessarily in this case, forgot to ask, but was there anything you were hoping I would ask about? So I know you've listed a lot of scholars and you gave some specific examples, but are there things that you would have listeners, and you could repeat things, that you would have them read, listen to, watch, etc., to get a better understanding of the development of Hebrew Bible?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ideal person that you were describing earlier, just a lay person sitting with maybe their NRSV Bible or whatever translation you have. If that's the case, that's where you're at. I do think that Pete Enns and Jared Bias stuff is a great entryway. They're really, really good at translating scholarship into an approachable way. So their books, Genesis and Exodus for normal people, are great places to get started. I think if you want something a little more complicated, I would recommend the other books that I said earlier. So E. Theodore Mullen's Ethnic Myths and Pentateuchal Foundations is great. Norman Wybray's The Making of the Pentateuch is great. My doctoral advisor, his name is David Aaron. He wrote a book called Genesis Ideology, and it presents Pentateuch scholarship at a really lay level. I think that's a great book too. I would say too, for Christians who are interested in this, and how does studying the Torah impact New Testament scholarship? There's some great stuff going on now on that topic too. So Paul Sloan just released Jesus and the Law of Moses, which is a great book. He does a podcast with Logan Williams called Jesus and Jewish Law, which is great
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, it
So,
is.
mhm.
I have yet to. I haven't picked up the book. He's right here in Houston, by the way. I every time I listen to that podcast, I'm like, we're so lucky to have a dude this smart in this city.
Mhm.
Yeah, that podcast is really helpful, and I know that was the thing. Andrew Rolero was like, "Oh, that's my recommend." In the
Mhm.
middle of the interview, he's like, "I know you're going to ask me for recommendations. That's the recommendation." And yeah, I'll foot stomp that again.
Yeah, they're great scholars, and they're also really great people. So, yeah.
I really I really enjoyed was it Jacob Wright's Why the Bible Began?
Yeah,
Did you
I
get
haven't
to
actually
read
read
that?
that yet, but I've seen that floating around. Yeah.
That one was helpful just to the first place I ever came across the documentary hypothesis was Walter Brueggemann, may he rest in peace, Introduction to the Old Testament.
Mhm.
And I was like, wait, what? I think I was 20, 21 years old. Wait, what? This is a thing? Like, what is going on? But jumping forward to, I think this past year when I read Wright's book, I was like, this is really helpful for the understanding that kind of on the ground, people are going back and they have an identity maybe formed already that they're taking back with them that again, we have just inherited an idea that they built that it's completely understandable that people would try to cohere as they're returning to their ancestral homeland.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, I won't give away anything else because I really do recommend that book. What do you read for fun?
Great question. I tend to just read other scholarly stuff that's outside of biblical studies. So my fun is so nerdy, but um, right now I'm reading. It's called Nature's God, and it's about the foundation of America and how obviously a lot of people assume that we have Christian origins. He's arguing for the opposite and really emphasizing the deism of the founders of the United States. So it's an interesting book, but yeah.
If it's fun for you, it's fun for you.
Yeah.
You don't have to make excuses. Anything else? I mean, that does sound interesting. Is there,
Yeah. Oh gosh, what else am I reading? I tried to read stuff in German more. Trying to get better at reading German. So my wife just bought me recently like a German reader. So it's like short stories that are at a certain level on the CFR language acquisition scale. But yeah, so trying to improve my German and work on that. Hopefully that'll help me read academic articles a little better. But yeah, my reading interests are pretty nerdy. So
is that enjoyable? The reading the German like that, or
it
is it just a
is.
utilitarian thing?
No, I find it enjoyable. Yeah, I like the. I'm having fun when I'm stimulated, so I like the challenge of it. So yeah, and at the end of each story, they'll list the vocabulary that might be a little more less well known, so that's helpful too.
Okay, well, knock yourself out then. Yeah, no judgment here if it's fun for you.
Yeah.
Well, what do you do to decompress then?
Yeah, so I'm a rock climber. Yeah, my wife and I rock climb at least twice a week, and then we climb outside as well. And so yeah, that's like what I'll do to get out of my mind and go exercise. So
Cool.
mhm.
Okay. Well, Evan Vossman, thank you for sitting down with me. Unless you have anything else, I'm going to call this one good.
Yeah, that's fine with me. Yeah, thanks so much. It's been fun to chat.
All right, man. Take care.
You too.
All right. That's one more episode down. In 4 days on the podcast, Stacia Deutsch will be talking about her book, Celebrating Hanukkah. So this is the third year that I've done the podcast. I have not gotten around to having holiday specific episodes with as much regularity as I would like. And so this year I decided I wanted to do Hanukkah. I initially wanted to do one for each night of Hanukkah, and I realized that was going to be quite an undertaking to coordinate, because I like to get things done far in advance. And I think it would be a big ask to have that many people record that far in advance of when the thing was coming out. So someday I hope to discuss the holidays of every tradition that engages with biblical text. But for now, I think, we'll call this the inaugural one. Hanukkah is a good place to start. So I decided to go on Amazon and find a children's book, because I figured that was probably the best way for me to learn, is the kind of book that someone would buy for a child to understand the celebration happening around them. I will have her recipe for latkes in the show notes to that episode. If you are listening right now for free, you can wait 4 days and hear this episode, or you can become a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/itmeanswhatitmeanspodcast, all one word. And if you do that, you can hear it now. So here is a quick preview of my conversation with Stacia Deutsch. If you get a chance to love someone, you should take it.
So there really are two stories of Hanukkah, right? And all of this influences how we commemorate and celebrate. So there is the history story is that there was a time where there was a Seleucid ruler over Judea, and Antiochus III was fine with Jewish religion. He let people practice. His son came in and did not let Jewish people practice their religion anymore. In fact, he went to conquer the holy building of the Jewish people in Jerusalem, the Great Temple. Some people died, and some people converted, and some people were assimilated, and some people fought. And Hanukkah is a commemoration of that battle, where the Maccabees, who were the fighters, they were the zealots. They were probably the people we would want to avoid nowadays. They were like the crazy zealots. They conquered the temple, they reclaimed the temple, and then they rededicated it. So that is one story. And that is written in the book of Maccabees. And that is like the base for it. 600 years later, the rabbis who were creating this body of literature called the Talmud didn't love that the story was a war story. That wasn't where they wanted it to be. They wanted it to be a God story.